You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. My co-host today is Cindy Johnson, award-winning volunteer of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses and ace proofreader. Hi, Cindy.
Hello, Jeremy.
I should mention that I introduced you as an ace proofreader because you've been helping me put the finishing touches on a new book called The Light at Fort Point. It's a new 250th anniversary edition of the history of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse in Newcastle, New Hampshire.
Yes, that's right. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, it should be out soon. In fact, let's see, we're speaking on, what's today, June 3rd, I think, maybe?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, June 3rd. And this is slated to be released on June 13th. The book might be available by the time people hear this. If not, it'll be available very soon. You'll be able to buy it through the Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse's website at portsmouthharborlighthouse.org and also on Amazon. And your help has been invaluable. In fact, you had some input on the design of the cover as well, which is a big help. So thanks.
I did. Yes. Well, that was really exciting for me too. I'm especially excited about that today because we just did that. We just did that yesterday.
Yeah.
So it's been fun for me too. So thank you.
Well, thank you again. But we could continue thanking each other.
Yeah, that's right. Back and forth for the rest of the show.
Should probably move on here. So this is episode 123 of Lighthearted, and this is June 13th, 2021. We'll hear an interview shortly with Caroline Taylor about the Signal House Museum in Scotland, which is closely related to the famous Bell Rock Lighthouse. First, Cindy, has anything interesting happened on this date in lighthouse history?
Well, yes, actually. Boston Light, which was established on Little Brewster Island in outer Boston Harbor in 1716, was the scene of fighting during the British occupation of Boston in 1775 and 76 during the Revolutionary War. Some British vessels lingered in Boston Harbor for a few months at the end of the occupation. As they left the area on June 13, 1776, one of their final acts was to set off a timed charge at Boston Light, completely destroying the tower. The remains of the metal lantern were used to make ladles for American cannons. A new tower was built in 1783, and that one still stands. Recent restoration work has revealed that the stonework near the bottom of the tower is different from the upper part of the tower, which indicates that the lower part of the original lighthouse was incorporated into the new one.
And also on June 13th, 1865, the poet William Butler Yeats was born in Ireland. He once said, quote, "Do not wait to strike till the iron is hot, but make it hot by striking," unquote. So, as I mentioned, today we're heading to Scotland. We'll be talking about a museum that is closely related to one of the most celebrated lighthouses in the world.
Wave-swept Bell Rock Lighthouse, about 5 miles from Arbroath in southeastern Scotland, was designed by the engineer Robert Stevenson of the famous Stevenson family of engineers. The granite tower, first lighted in 1811, was built so well that none of it has needed to be repaired or replaced in more than 200 years. It's the oldest wave-swept or sea-washed granite lighthouse in the world.
The keepers at Bell Rock lived inside the tower itself. The lighthouse operated in tandem with a shore station known as the Bell Rock Signal Tower, built in 1813 in Arbroath. The signal tower housed the families of the keepers, along with personnel who ran the lighthouse tender that supplied the light station.
The name of the Bell Rock Signal Tower comes from the signaling apparatus that was used to communicate between the shore station and the lighthouse. There was a power telescope in the signal tower that was used to monitor communications from the lighthouse. The signaling apparatus involved the use of a ball that was hoisted up and down on a pole.
After it was decommissioned, the signal tower was used as housing for the Arbroath Town Council beginning in 1955. It was converted into a museum in the 1970s. The museum has exhibits on Bell Rock Lighthouse and its keepers, as well as exhibits on the local manufacturing and fishing industries.
ANGUSalive is the culture, sport, and leisure trust for the County of Angus, offering residents and visitors to Angus sports centers, parks, theaters, museums, galleries, archives, and libraries. The Signal House is one of several museums operated by ANGUSalive.
Caroline Taylor is the Heritage Learning and Engagement Lead at ANGUSalive. I spoke with her recently. Let's listen to our conversation now. I'm speaking today with Caroline Taylor of ANGUSalive and the Signal Tower Museum in Scotland. Thank you so much for being with me today, Caroline.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited for this.
Great. I'm excited too. It's a really interesting subject. And, I wasn't aware of your museum until maybe a few months ago when a man named Peter Gelletley told me about it. You might know Peter. Do you know Peter?
No, I don't know Peter. No. I've heard the name though, definitely.
Okay, yeah, he's a real Scottish lighthouse aficionado. I almost said fanatic. I think you'd agree with that too if I said fanatic. But he put out a book, a guide to Scottish lighthouses called "Following the Lights," and has a website and a collection of lighthouse artifacts that he shows in different places and stuff. So he's a great guy. I had him on the podcast, and he told me your museum is one of the subjects I should do on the podcast. So I'm glad he told me. Starting out, I just want to ask a little bit about what you do. And in your work you do with ANGUSalive, I believe you're also involved with other museums besides the Signal Tower Museum. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that's right. So ANGUSalive is a charitable kind of leisure trust that looks after the museums amongst other services on behalf of Angus Council. So we have 5 museums that I work in. There's Montrose Museum, Kirriemuir Museum, Forfar-Methven Museum, Brechin Townhouse Museum, and of course Arbroath Signal Tower Museum. So very busy, lots of different objects for lots of different topics and local history. It's brilliant.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. It sounds like a lot of mental juggling you must have to do. Keep everything going the way it should. So what actually led you to your position there with ANGUSalive?
Well, I've always been interested in history. I did a history degree and actually a master's in museum and gallery studies at the University of St Andrews. And while I was studying history, I was volunteering at various museums at the same time. So that's how I got into museums generally. And my actual first proper museum job was as a museum assistant at Signal Tower Museum. So that was obviously back when it was Angus Council that still looked after the museum. And obviously I live in Dundee and Arbroath is just up the road. So it was really good and it was a fantastic place to work. I worked with a really great team, the other museum assistant, Louisa, and my manager, Kirsten. We had so much fun there. We came up with different activities. We were obviously in a really unique location. And that is where the course of my life changed completely because I totally fell in love with lighthouses, particularly the Bell Rock Lighthouse. Although definitely I would say I'm not an expert, just very enthusiastic about the topic. Kind of because of this, I ended up working at the Scottish Lighthouse Museum up in Fraserburgh for a couple of years. Then I came back down to work at Montrose Museum, which is obviously one of the ANGUSalive museums. Less focus on lighthouses, more of a focus on kind of maritime history generally, along with everything from like Napoleon's death mask, Pictish stones, ancient Egyptian statues. And then later I was promoted to Heritage Learning and Engagement Lead for all 5 museums in ANGUSalive. And I think I have the best job ever because I just get to chat to people about their local history and get them passionate and excited for it.
Oh, it sounds perfect. I'd like to talk a bit about the history of Bell Rock Lighthouse, which is really one of the world's great lighthouses. It's one I've certainly known about for a long time. Why is it so famous? I think most of our listeners are probably somewhat familiar with it, but what makes Bell Rock Lighthouse so significant?
Well, I think first of all, obviously the fact it is the oldest sea-washed lighthouse in the world and is also called one of the 7 wonders of the industrial world. So automatically, like that fact just makes it absolutely incredible in itself. I also think how it kind of came to be is obviously part of that. How it was built is fascinating. So the Bell Rock Lighthouse is built on the Inchcape Reef, which is also known as the Bell Rock because of a local legend involving an abbot and a pirate and everything like this. So it's an incredibly dangerous reef for passing ships because most of it kind of lies under the surface of the sea. It is like incredibly treacherous for passing ships. And obviously being very close to harbours, Dundee, Arbroath amongst others, there were a lot of passing ships for it to be a danger to. That kind of meant that there was a lot of calls for the lighthouse to be built, but it didn't happen for a wee while because of the impracticalities of actually building a lighthouse on this rock. It was a very kind of hard, jagged rock. Building the foundation for it, they weren't just digging into soil, they were actually digging into proper solid rock, which you can imagine that would be difficult now, let alone when they were building it with just kind of hand tools and sheer physical strength. So I think that in itself is fascinating, and all the issues that they had in building it. They had to build a barracks out on the rock to house the men so that they could kind of get on the rock more quickly, to have more time to actually build it. Yeah, I think that kind of goes into why the Bell Rock's most quite significant, because of that kind of hardship. I think you can picture how difficult that must have been out on the rock. I also think the Bell Rock as well, you can see instantly when you look at it that it looks like the kind of archetypical isolated lighthouse, and I think you do get a real understanding of how difficult it must have been for a lighthouse keeper, essentially in an upright tube in the middle of the sea for most of the day, not even being able to go for a walk around the lighthouse, just kind of stuck in this narrow building. So I think kind of in our kind of imagination again, you can visualize through the Bell Rock how difficult that role was. It also helps that there's the really nice painting by Turner, painted of the Bell Rock as well, which is fantastic. I think, that kind of shows this kind of stormy seas and part of the almost romance of the lighthouse, the rock and being on a rock in the middle of the sea.
Well, it's definitely, you said, use the word archetypal. It's the classic, we might say wave swept here. You call it a sea washed lighthouse. Wave swept is another term that's used for it sometimes.
Oh, I like wave swept.
Well, they're both very fitting. I love sea wash too, but both really tell the story. I think probably the other most famous wave swept or sea washed lighthouse in the world would be Eddystone. But Eddystone has been rebuilt 3 times, whereas Bell Rock, it's amazing, it's still standing strong after 210 years. That's
and the fact it was obviously the design for the layers of rock and the dovetailing, that was actually based on the design of the Eddystone. So it's kind of interesting that one didn't last the test of time, but the Bell Rock did.
Yeah, well, dovetailing is used in many of that type of lighthouse, including one not too far from where I live here, just south of Boston, a couple of hours from me. There's Minot's Ledge Lighthouse. I don't know if you know about that, but it's more than 100 feet tall. It's a granite tower on a submerged ledge. The ledge is completely underwater at high tide, and took 5 years to build, 1855 to 60. And it's the first lighthouse fell over there, and 2 keepers died before that. So it's got quite an interesting history. And you're talking about life inside around offshore lighthouse like that. And I've heard that one of the early keepers at Minot's Ledge Lighthouse had to resign because he couldn't stand round walls anymore. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's not that hard to believe.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah, I could imagine that. You must have had a particular temperament to have a long career as a lighthouse keeper.
Especially at a place like that, there's no doubt about it. So on this podcast, we've certainly discussed Robert Stevenson a few times. His name comes up. If you're talking about lighthouses in the world, the name Robert Stevenson is going to come up at some point. Of course, Stevenson and the whole Stevenson family, it was a family of engineers, except for one exception who was better known as a writer, Robert Lewis. But why is Robert Stevenson so important in the history of lighthouses?
Well, I think because kind of what you've just said, that he or one of his family members, they had a hand in pretty much every lighthouse in Scotland. Yeah, and I think kind of, you have this great kind of dynasty of lighthouse engineers, apart from the one that goes off to become a world famous author and poet. Yeah, I think that that's definitely a major reason. I also think that as far as Robert Stevenson was concerned, like his personality, I think is part of the reason he's so important. Like he clearly wasn't afraid of the challenge, like building the Bell Rock. He was super keen from the outset that there would be a light built on the Bell Rock. So I think the fact he kind of wasn't afraid of a challenge, he had this kind of ambition and perseverance. And I think that makes him an interesting figure. And that is why he's still so important in the history of the lighthouses.
Let's move on to the signal tower itself, which is obviously your museum's reason for being, and the fact that it was a shore station. But can you explain a bit more about what the role of the signal tower was in relation to the lighthouse?
Yeah, sure. So the signal tower, it was also built by Robert Stevenson. After the Bell Rock Lighthouse, the construction on that was completed in 1811. He started to build signal tower, and that was completed in 1813. So the signal tower was essentially the shore station for the Bell Rock Lighthouse. So you had the keepers' houses, the accommodation for the master of the tender, the kind of supply base, and obviously the means for signalling to the lighthouse, which was absolutely vital for the keepers, especially obviously this is in the days before radios and things like that. So that signal tower, that was their kind of one link back to the land when they were on this lighthouse. So yeah, definitely played a vital part in helping to keep the men safe.
The signal tower, it's what we refer to as the signal tower, is actually more than one building. Is that right? It's kind of a complex.
Yeah, that's right. So there's the main building, as we call it, which as you kind of go in, that's the first one you see. It's kind of the tall one with the signal tower kind of within it. And that is where the master of the tender, that's where his quarters would have been. There's also kind of like storage huts kind of next to the buildings. And there's two cottages on either side of you as you enter the courtyard. And that's where the keepers' families would have stayed. So yeah, it also rents a really nice courtyard. And in the courtyard now, there's a circle built into the stone, and that circle is the exact same size as the foundation level of the Bell Rock Lighthouse. Oh. So if you do ever get to come to Signal Tower, you'll get a complete visual clue of how big that base was. And then there is also a little garden kind of at the back of the main building as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I really, really hope I can get there. I was in Scotland in 2017, but not to that part exactly, but I really hope to make it back. We'll talk more about what's at the museum for people to see in a few minutes, but back to the role of the signal tower. How did that work exactly? How were signals sent back and forth to the lighthouse?
So basically, on top of Signal Tower, there's a copper ball mechanism, which is now painted red, so it can be seen even more easily. And basically, at the Bell Rock, they would have had a similar copper ball mechanism on the lighthouse. And essentially, every day at the lighthouse, they would raise the copper ball on the mechanism up the pole. They'd raise that daily between 9 and 10 every morning. The people at the signal tower, they'd be watching for that signal. When they got that signal, the ball is raised, everything is okay with the lighthouse. They would then raise the copper ball at signal tower to say, we've received your message, all is well. If the signal ball was raised only halfway or wasn't raised at all, that meant that there was a problem at the Bell Rock. So they would pretty much scramble to get the tender ready to get out and see what the problem was, and whether it was an ill lighthouse keeper or they'd run out of supplies or anything like that. They put the tender to sea immediately to find out what the problem was. Stevenson did have other ideas for signalling to the keepers from Signal Tower. I know we're going to talk about things in the museum more in a bit, but he did this amazing book of different signal flags that they could have used. Beautiful colour book that's on display in the museum. They also ran experiments with heliographing and even sending pigeons as kind of messenger pigeons out to the lighthouse. The kind of story, I think, shows in a way kind of how the signal was used and also what life was like for the keepers. That's quite interesting. when a keeper had to have a shift on at the lighthouse, he kind of had to go. You didn't get time off if your wife was ready to give birth. So if his wife gave birth while he was on the Bell Rock, they would raise up either a little petticoat or a little pair of trousers, so he knew whether he had a boy or a girl.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
that's
it's
sort of
things like that. Yeah.
Sort of a reveal party of that day, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, pretty much. A lot less dangerous than some of the ones nowadays. So much safer to just raise a pair of trousers or a dress on a signaling mechanism. Maybe people should take that up.
Yeah, actually, I like that a lot. So you mentioned pigeons were suggested. I don't know if they're the carrier pigeons, messenger pigeons weren't actually tried there, were they? Or it was
in 1823, they had an experiment using the kind of homing pigeons to carry messages, but it wasn't very successful because the winds are so strong out there that they kind of get blown off course quite a lot.
Yeah.
So it wasn't repeated, unfortunately.
Yeah, they tried that at lighthouses in the U.S., but I'm not sure how extensively. I don't think it was done for that long. I know that they at least tried it from Boone Island, which is a lighthouse several miles off the coast, not far from me, off southern Maine here. So a little pile of rocks out in the ocean. I know they tried it there. Typically, well, you mentioned, of course, that if they needed a doctor, that was probably one reason for sending signals, or if there was a birth or whatever. But what other types of messages would typically be sent back and forth?
I guess if they were running low on supplies or they had an accident or something like that, but often the signal just meant like send a boat out. And there is a story that on one occasion out at the lighthouse, there were two large black cormorants, and they basically sat on the lighthouse signal poles, and over at the signal tower, that was mistaken for the send boat signal. So They went right out there and found nothing to report. So it was obviously very kind of basic messages that would have been sent back and forth at that time.
How far offshore again is the lighthouse?
11 miles offshore, just over 11 miles. Yeah.
Yeah. So did they have like telescopes on at the lighthouse and at the signal tower to see back and forth?
Yeah, there was a chromatic telescope at a signal tower that basically sat on the top of the tower next to the mechanism that they could look over at the lighthouse. And obviously the lighthouse had telescopes as well. With the naked eye, you can actually see the Bell Rock from signal tower just on the horizon, but it's literally just a tiny little blip on the horizon. You would definitely need a telescope to be able to see it in any detail.
Yeah. When I was in Scotland, I was able to see Bell Rock, the lighthouse, as a tiny little speck in the distance. And that was a thrill for me just to know that was Bell Rock. Extremely exciting. How many keepers were typically assigned to Bell Rock Lighthouse at one time?
So usually it would have been 3 keepers at the Bell Rock at one time. So the principal keeper and 2 assistants. So you can imagine 3 men living in a lighthouse all at one time. It was very kind of cramped conditions.
Yeah. Did they have like a rotation, or were 3 out there always at one time, or was one on shore leave, or how did that work?
No, they tended to have 3 out at one time just for kind of safety reasons, basically. There is a story that kind of came about because there was a lighthouse, I think Smalls Lighthouse in Wales, that had 2 keepers, and one of them died and the other one went mad. So I'm not sure the truth to that, but yeah, apparently that's why they liked having the 3 men there in case a similar kind of tragedy happened.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a true story. It's a pretty gruesome, sad story. I just interviewed an English lighthouse keeper, Neil Hargreaves, who's the president of the Association of Lighthouse Keepers, and he one of the lighthouses where he was stationed was the Smalls, and so he was extremely aware of that particular story, which has inspired a couple of movies and other things, I believe.
Oh yeah, I can see why.
Yeah. So when the keepers were out at the lighthouse, their families, as you mentioned, lived at the signal tower complex there. I understand the staff at the signal tower, in addition to obviously receiving and sending signals, you mentioned that they would often have a boat go out there. So was it the same staff? Did they bring the boat out and also deliver supplies on some kind of regular basis to the lighthouse?
Yeah, so yeah, it was them that kind of went out on the tender to deliver the supplies, and the supplies did include the kind of like relief keeper as well as the actual items. So it was every 2 weeks, roughly, depending on the tide, the boat would arrive, and it would have things like fresh food, water, oil, coal, spare parts, kind of things like that. If the food couldn't be landed, unfortunately for the keepers, they would have to go onto the kind of hardtack, the dry crackers, and embalmed beef. So not quite as tasty. We do also have a shopping list from 1987, and the list included 6 cans of Coke because they were wanting to watch a Dundee football match on the television that evening, drinking their cans of Coke at the same time.
They weren't allowed to drink beer, probably, so Coke was...
No, they weren't allowed alcohol, so Coke would have been the treat instead.
Yeah. Obviously, it was an interesting life living out there at Bell Rock. We've said a little bit about that, how it took a certain kind of person. But are there any particular stories about the keepers and lives at Bell Rock that you find really interesting?
Probably the funniest story I was told was by John Both, who was the last principal lighthouse keeper at the Bell Rock before it was automated in 1988. So obviously toilet facilities were quite limited. In fact, there wasn't even any sort of toilet until 1964 actually on the lighthouse at all. Yeah. So the keepers were kind of used to having, like kind of cans to use under the bed, and that lasted even after the toilet. And there was one guy that basically John Both worked with, and he was really bad for just like leaving these cans about the place. So it was a joke. They kind of like put holes in it. So the next time he used it, he ended up with, what he'd been doing all over his feet. So,
oh, man. Oh, wow.
Yeah, it really stuck with me because I'm not giving the story justice. The way he told it, it was absolutely hilarious. But I think it kind of shows, like the human side, like the kind of pranks and stuff.
Yeah. No, I was just reading something lately about, at lighthouses like that, how pranks were so common, and they had to keep things kind of loose and not so serious all the time. But that's a pretty mean prank you just described, but funny at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the museum itself. Obviously, this past year has been very different. It's been different for everybody all over the world, basically. How has that affected you? The pandemic, was the museum closed for a period of time?
So the museum is actually still closed at the moment. We did reopen for a spell in October, but then around Christmas time, obviously the situation worsened here again, so we had to close down. We decided we'd wait until 1st of June is when we'll reopen ahead of our summer season. But it is difficult, obviously, with the museum having to be closed and not being able to welcome all the visitors that we usually do.
Sure. Well, people will be hearing this after June 1st, so it will be reopened by the time people hear this. So let's talk about what's in the museum. You touched on a little bit before, but what sorts of exhibits are there for people to see?
Well, the kind of primary kind of purpose of the signal tower is to tell the story of the Bell Rock from basically its conception, there being danger with the Inchcape Reef right up until automation. So we've got a kind of range of interesting things related to that. We've got some of the items that were recovered from the wreck of the HMS Argyle. It actually crashed into the Bell Rock during the First World War and was sunk, unfortunately. And fairly recently, divers went down and found different items related to that. We've got a copy of Stevenson's book detailing how the Bell Rock was built. We've got a lens panel from the Bell Rock, which is peppered with kind of holes, which is from where it was used as target practice from a Luftwaffe plane during the Second World War. We've got some really amazing models of the lighthouse, and also like kind of visitors' books, letters, photographs of keepers and items belonging to the keepers, things like that. As well as the Bell Rock, we do also have exhibits telling the story of like the fishing industry in Arbroath, the textile industry and the lawnmower industry, the things that Arbroath was fairly well known for in the past.
Okay, that sounds like there's a lot to see. When people visit, I don't think you mentioned, do people go up in the tower itself?
That's actually really interesting because people can't at the moment go up the tower except on those open days in September. We do special events for that. But we are currently doing a project to open the tower to the public. It's something we're working on. Basically, to go up the tower, there's a spiral staircase, which is fine. I mean, obviously there are dangers involved in that too, but largely fine. But then you have to go up to kind of ladders almost to actually get into the tower room and get to the top. So that's something we need to look at, how we can make that safe for people to come up the tower. And it also needs a fresh coat of paint and everything like that inside. And because it's a listed building, we obviously have to liaise with Historic Environment Scotland on what we can actually do to kind of redecorate it and finish it. But we are undergoing that project now. So fingers crossed, in a couple of years, it will be open to the public, which would be great for tours, for visitors.
Yeah. Because if you get lighthouse buffs always want to climb upstairs to the top of any, whether it's a lighthouse or any kind of tower. I think that would have some attraction for.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So if people come to Arbroath to see your museum, are there other things they could check out in the area, other things to see?
Yeah, so probably the most significant thing in Arbroath is Arbroath Abbey. It's where the Declaration of Arbroath was signed, which was basically Scotland announcing its independence from England. So definitely visitors can come see the Abbey. It's really interesting. There's also obviously our other museums in the Angus area. And also if you're into kind of picture stone circles, you can see a lot of that in the local area as well. And the harbour itself in Arbroath is really nice, and there's a really good ice cream shop and fish and chip shop there. And you can also get Arbroath Smokies, which is basically just smoked fish, very tasty. So you can snack on those if you come through as well.
I love smoked fish, and smoked haddock was a thing that seemed fairly common over there that we don't get much here. So I'd like to come there and try your local smoked fish. That sounds good to me. But so much about it sounds great, and your museum sounds great. It's really fascinating, and I do want to visit there, and I hope some of our listeners can make it there. But for now, I have one final question for you, and this is for bonus points. Okay. So the question is, what is your favorite part of your involvement with the Signal Tower Museum?
I think definitely the sense of history that you get just being in the building. It is like, it has the kind of like original like worn flagstone floors throughout the museum and everything like that. So you can almost see the places where people's feet over time have walked. Also, although I've just said that the public can't do this, it is really nice getting to go up to the tower and having that view of the surrounding area. I do also think that we do have an important story to tell about the Bell Rock and the building of the Bell Rock. And it is really brilliant to kind of engage a larger audience with that story and portray that to the public, and to keep the story of the building of the Bell Rock and all the stories of the keepers and everything alive. So that's definitely a lot of good fun and something I really enjoy.
Yeah. Well, that shows how much you love it. Really comes through. You know, I said that was the final question, but I'm going to sneak in one more question for you here. If people visit there to come to your museum and see other things in the area, can they also get a boat ride out to see the lighthouse more closely? Is that possible?
Yes, definitely. There's a couple of boats from Arbroath Harbour that go out. The one that I've been on is the Predator, goes out there. And it's really great. You can go right up to the lighthouse, obviously tide dependent, have a look. And on the way back, they'll even take you along so you can see the amazing red Arbroath cliffs as well.
Wow. I've got to get there.
Scotland,
Scotland in general is fascinating, and I thoroughly enjoyed my visit, mainly to the Edinburgh area back in 2017. I think more U.S. Lighthouse Society tours will be going there in the future, and I hope they can include your museum in the tours in the future. So, Caroline Taylor, it's been wonderful talking with you and learning about your museum, and I hope maybe we can talk again sometime. But I really appreciate you spending this time with me today.
No, thank you for talking and getting information out about Signal Tower to an even wider audience, which is fantastic.
To learn more about the Signal House Museum and the other attractions managed by ANGUSalive, visit angusalive.scot. That's ANGUSALIVE.SCOT.
That museum really looks like an interesting place to visit, especially if you can take a boat ride out to see the Bell Rock Lighthouse. I've always been fascinated by the isolated wave-swept granite lighthouses, or sea-washed lighthouses, as they call them in the British Isles. And Bell Rock is I'd say the granddaddy of that type of lighthouse. So, Cindy, we have a couple of extra minutes. Mm-hmm. So, have you heard any good lighthouse jokes lately?
Of course. Okay, here goes.
Okay.
How do lighthouse keepers communicate?
I don't know. I give up. How?
Shine language.
Okay, well, I guess it's my fault. I didn't ask you if you heard any good lighthouse jokes. Well, at least you didn't tell me that one about the radio communication between a battleship and a lighthouse. I've heard that one at least 1,000 times, I'd say.
Oh, yeah. I like that one.
Well, you can like it if you want. For anybody who out there, and it's hard to believe that any lighthouse buffs wouldn't know that joke, but for anybody who doesn't, just Google the words battleship and lighthouse at the same time, and I'm sure you'll find that joke very easily. Some people think that joke is based on a true story about communication between a battleship and a lighthouse. It's not a true story. To the best of my knowledge, it's not based on anything factual.
I may have thought that at one point, that it was based on a true story.
Well, now you know better. Also, there's a...
We can pretend.
We can, if it makes you feel good to pretend. You can do that. There's also a YouTube video, very high production value video. It looks like somebody spent millions of dollars on it. But if you search YouTube for lighthouse and battleship, you'll probably find it. It's again a really slickly produced video of dramatizing that joke.
Ooh, I'll have to look that up on YouTube. So I don't have any more lighthouse jokes, but did you hear about the 2 satellite dishes that got married?
No, I haven't heard about that. Please tell me, by all means.
Well, the wedding was boring, but the reception was excellent.
And that gets the much higher rating than the previous one, that's for sure. Be sure to check out uslhs.org to learn about everything the U.S. Lighthouse Society offers. And for everybody out there who uses Apple Podcasts to listen to this podcast, please rate and review us.
Next week's episode of Lighthearted will feature an interview with Marlene O'Connell Russell, Site Supervisor for Cape Bonavista Light Station in Newfoundland, Canada.
To all our regular listeners and also our new ones, thank you so much for listening. And as always,
keep a good light.